Welcome to the second weekly coding challenge. In these challenges, we get a prompt and you can build out the project in whatever programming language or framework you like. And once you're finished, you can share it on Twitter with the hashtag #weeklycodingchallenge. This week's prompt comes from Florin Pop's app ideas on GitHub. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Today we'll be doing the binary to decimal converter. What's nice about these coding challenges is that he gives us all the user stories right there in the prompt. So here are our user stories. The first one is the user can enter an 8-digit binary number in a single input. The second user story is that the user is notified when they enter a character that's not a 0 or a 1. And finally, the last user story is that the user can see the decimal number displayed in a single output. So now that we've got all the user stories figured out, the next part is the tech stack. I'll be using the same tech stack as last time, the React with React Bootstrap for styling, and Jest and React testing library for test-driven development. If you don't know what test-driven development is, I suggest you go back and watch the first few minutes of the last weekly coding challenge. But in a nutshell, test-driven development has 3 phases. The first is the red phase where we write the test. Next is the green phase where we write the code to make the test pass. And finally, we have the refactor phase where we go back and clean everything up. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's get started. Okay, so just like last time, we have our boilerplate React application, except that I already installed React Bootstrap, because that took forever last time. So we can come into app.js, and I might rename it to JSX. And just like we did before, we'll gut all this out. And just leave an empty div, because we're going to start by writing the test first. So I'll empty out all these random tests and describe our app component. Okay, so the first user story was that the user can enter an 8-digit binary number in a single input. So first, I'm going to say test should enter up to 8 characters in a single input. Well, I guess that should say it should enter 8 binary numbers. Well, we'll say characters for now because we'll fix the next part later. So just like before, I'm going to grab the get by label text out of the render method. So const render, rendering our app component. I don't like that. So get by label, get by label text. So now we can grab the input from the app component. So const will say binary input equals get by label text, and we'll call it binary. And so that's pretty much the arrange step in our test here. Well, next we can act on our component. Now notice in the test description I said up to 8 characters. So that means we need to test if the user enters less than 8 characters, it should contain that value. If the user enters exactly 8 characters, the value should be the same as was entered. But if it enters more than 8 values, then it should just take the first 8. You could separate these into 3 different tests, but I'm going to leave it in one. So the first part we're going to test is if we enter less than 8 characters. So we'll use the user events again. User events dot clear to get rid of any placeholder text or default values. And we'll say binary input. And then we're going to use the user event to type. We're going to type in the binary input and we'll say something like 0, 1. Here we run into a problem because we're going to have to assert that the value at this point in the test is actually 0, 1. We also have to move on to test that the input is correct if the user enters exactly 8 characters. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to store the value of the input at this point in a variable. So I'll actually make 3 variables. We'll say let maybe small value, same value, and large or long value. So these are all 3 variables that don't have values right now. But we can say that the small value is equal to binary input dot value. No, dot value. There we go. And so we've saved that value for later, and we can clear the input again. So I'll just copy that. And we can also type in it again. So, oops. Yeah, take this one. And so maybe we want to have 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. We'll say that. And we'll store this value in the same value. Right, and lastly, we're going to copy these 2 again. And we're going to say, we can add a 0 onto the value that we're typing in. So now there's actually 9 characters in that value. And we'll say long value is equal to binary input dot value. So that's the act step. Lastly is the assert step in our test. So we're going to expect that the small value to be, and we said 0, 1. Right, and we're also going to expect that the same value, same value to be, to be, we said 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. And we're also going to expect the large value, large value to be the same. Long value, my bad, it was long value, to be the same because it shouldn't accept that last character. Okay, so if we save that and we come here and we run npm test, and our test fails, right, as it should. So we'll change this div to an input with a type of text and an area label of binary. So that should solve the first part of our test. Now it's saying that I misspelled user event on line 16. Oops. Which means it's also messed up here. Okay. So now it's saying that the input is accepting more than 8 characters. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to store the value of the input in state. So we can say use state, and we'll call it binary, and we'll set it to an empty string. And we'll say that the value of the input is that binary that we got from state. So usually we would assign the set binary function to the onChange function, but we're going to have to do a few extra checks before we update the state. So we can say const handle, we'll call it handle change binary, and it's going to take the E for event, And we'll grab the new binary number that we're trying to change, and we'll say const new bin is equal to e.target.value, right? And we want to check that this string is not longer than 8 characters. So we can say if the new bin dot length is less than or equal to 8, then we can set binary to the new bin. And we'll take this function and we'll put it into the onChange event here. Let me clean this up real fast. Okay, so if we come back to the tests, handle change binary. Syntax error on change. Oops, those should be curly braces, not parentheses. That's weird. And I forgot to import use state. Nice, and so now our tests pass. So the next user story was the user is notified when they enter a character that is not a 0 or a 1. So let's write the test for that. So test should notify when character is not 0 or 1. Right? So just like before, we'll render the app. And we'll do the get by label text. Get by label text. We'll grab the input again, const binary input get by label text binary. And what we'll do is first we'll clear it out just in case. User event dot clear binary input, and we're going to type in that binary input user event dot type. I'm going to type in the binary input, and we're going to type, say, ABC. So those are not obviously not 0s or 1s. So now we're going to check. We could check first that the value of the binary input is empty. So expect binary input dot value to be an empty string. Could do that, but we can also check that there's an error message and that it contains some text. So we can expect that get by label text, we'll call it error message. We can say to have text content, and we'll say something like only 0s and 1s allowed, or something like that, right? So I think that's about it for this test, so we can save it. And we see that we're failing because it's actually accepting. So the input is actually accepting those weird characters. To check that the input is only taking 0s and 1s, we're going to use a regular expression. And regular expressions are used to check for patterns in a string of text. Okay, so we can create a regular expression. We'll call it bin regex. And so here we have a pattern, so we're saying that we're looking for only 0s and 1s. and we're saying that between spaces there should be only 0 and 1. So if you can picture like a single word, a string of characters without spaces, and those should all be 0s and 1s. So inside of the if block that we already have, we're going to have another if statement. So it's going to be, we're going to say if bin regex dot test, and we're going to pass in our new bin, and if that returns true, then we should be able to add or to update our binary number. So if we save that, when we run the test, we'll find that things are going a little bit nuts because we're not accepting empty strings. So this regular expression does not accept empty strings. So when we're clearing the input, it's not accepting that change. So we can also say if new bin is equal to the empty string, or the binary, or the regex test passes, then add it, or then update the binary state. Okay, so now it's telling us that, hey, wait a minute, I don't see any error message element on the page. So let's fix that. So for now, I'm going to make a fragment. So that we can add a paragraph with an area label of error message. Okay, so now it's telling us we found the element, but there's nothing inside. So again, we're going to use state to keep track of an error message. So here we can say use state error message, and we'll start it with an empty string. So we want the error message to be displayed if we didn't update the state. So we can come after this if block where we use the regex and say else, and we're going to set the error message, and I'm going to copy the error message that we expected here. Copy it in there just to make sure we get any typos or anything. And we also want to set the error message to an empty string if we were successful in updating the binary state. So set error message to an empty string. And one more thing we need to do is we need to say that the error message is going to be the content of the paragraph. It would also be nice if we just didn't show the paragraph if the error message was empty. So error message and the paragraph. So if the error message is empty, the paragraph won't be shown. So we save, and now that second test passed. Okay, so now our third test was that the user can actually see the decimal number being displayed in a single output. So test should display a decimal number. Okay, and just like before, I'm going to copy this. The arrange and the act part of the last test, and I'm going to change the text that we type in here, and we're going to do our 0110011. So now the arrange and act step have been completed. Now we can do the assertion. So expect, and we're going to get by label text an element that's labeled decimal. and we're going to expect it to have text content. And the decimal equivalent for that binary string is actually 103. And we'll see how we get that in a minute. Right, so we'll save this and run the test again. And it's already saying I can't find an element that's called decimal. So we can have another paragraph with an area label of decimal. Alright, so we're still failing because that decimal is empty. So again, we're going to need some state. So we'll say use state. We'll call it decimal, and we'll set it to an empty string. Now we could update the decimal at the same time as we're changing the binary number, but then we'd have a lot of different things going on in this function. Typically you want functions to do only one thing. And you could argue that we're already doing two different things inside of this function. We're updating the error and we're updating the binary number in the same function. So we should definitely do that decimal update in a different function. And fortunately, React has another hook called use effect. So I'm going to clean this out really fast. So in the use effect, don't forget to import it. This function inside that we're passing into it, it'll run whenever the variables inside of this array, inside of this array here, this function will run whenever they get changed. So if there's an empty array, it'll just run once when the entire app loads or when the component loads. But here we want to add binary. So this function will run every time the binary number gets updated. So the simplest part that I can think of right now is when the binary text is an empty string, the decimal should also be an empty string. So if binary is equal to an empty string, then set decimal to be an empty string. Okay, else we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff. Oops. Right, so let's look at how binary numbers work. So here I have a binary to decimal converter, and I'm going to type in our number, our 011001111. And just like I promised, the result is 103. But if we come down here, we can look at how it got that. So first of all, we can see that it's looping through the string from left to right. Right, so if this was a string of characters, it's starting with 0 in the 0 index, and it's working its way all the way across the string. So we can start by looping through our string. So we can say for let I equal 0, and I is less than binary dot length and I plus plus. Okay, so next we can see that we're multiplying the 0 or the 1 by 2 to the something power, right? So whenever you multiply anything by 0, it's going to come out to 0 anyway. So we can safely ignore the zeros and only work with the ones. So we could say if binary I at index I is equal to the string 1, the string with the number 1, then we're going to do some calculations. And so you'll notice as it's iterating through each of the characters, it's adding onto some well, is adding them all up. So we need to keep track of this sum. So I'm going to make a variable called new deck, and we'll set it to 0. Okay, so if we look at the 2 to the whatever number power, it starts with 2 to the 7th when it's at the 0 index character. Then it moves to 2 to the 6th and 2 to the 5th, and it works its way all the way down to 2 to the 0. So we know that the length of the string is 8. And we know that at the 0 index, we're going to the 7th power. So I plus 1 power. So we can say that we're adding 2 to the length minus I plus 1 power. So we might say that the new deck is plus equals math.pow, and our base is 2, and we'll say we'll say binary dot length minus I plus 1. And you can say I minus 1 and get rid of the parentheses, but we'll do it this way. Right? And at the end of all of that, we can set decimal to the new des. And lastly, we should display the new des in the decimal output. Oops, decimal. And already we can see that our third test is passing. So now that all the functionality is done, let's work on making this thing look better. So npm start to look at our app. And okay, so all we have is this ugly input here. So since I have the bootstrap and everything already installed, I'm going to make this fragment a container with a class name with my 5 to add in a whole bunch of padding on the top and the bottom, or a whole bunch of margin on the top and the bottom. Okay, so for what I'm imagining here, the React Bootstrap library actually has a component. And a component called the input group. Input group. Here we go, input group. And see how it has, you can have an input and you can have some text next to it like this. So we can start with that. So I will grab this last input group because I think that's the large one. Or there is a large one somewhere. Oh, here. So input group size large. So we'll grab this. And we'll put it here, and we'll clean it up. Oops. Okay. I'm going to get rid of this form control. And I'm going to move the input into there where the form control was and make the input a form control. We can get rid of that ID. I don't see why we'd need it. And instead of having the large text here, I'm going to have the decimal. So that means that I can get rid of this last input over here, or this last paragraph. But I also have to make sure that the area label it is decimal. Oh, and I have a syntax error. Control, oh no, that's container. And we don't have input group imported. So let's do that. Oh, and I think I forgot to add the style sheet. So once you install React Bootstrap, don't forget to add the style sheet to your index or app, doesn't matter. Right, so now we got this nice large input. I also want to make sure that that text always takes up half of the screen width. So we can say style and the style will be width and it'll take 50%. Right. And I also want the binary to be before the decimal, so put that first. And another thing that would be cool is if the text came out from the middle, so we can have, say, class name text end, so that the input, the text will be on the right side, and the binary with text will be on the left side. Oops. So now it's converting it. Oop. And both the texts are in the center of the screen. Okay, so that's that part done. Would also be nice to have some labels there, so that people know which is which. So above the input group, we're gonna have a row. And that row is gonna have 2 columns. And I'm not gonna put sizes on the columns because I want them to stay the way that they are. So, oops. We'll put a paragraph in here and we'll give it a display of 6 because I want it to be pretty big. And this one is binary. And a paragraph display 6. And this one is decimal. Oh, we didn't import the column. Perfect. And the binary should also be text right or text end. Okay. Next thing we can do is to fix the error message. So maybe instead of a paragraph, we can use an alert. React Bootstrap, and the variant will be danger. Now if I come in here and I type A, right, then we can see the error message. This text should be centered as well. We'll just keep going with that centered theme here. Text, center. Right, so the text is centered. I would also like some spacing. So I'll say 4 on the top and bottom. Okay. And lastly, it would be good to have a title, I think, for this application. So we'll come up here and we'll say H1. We'll say binary to decimal converter. Right, and the class name display1, text center, and maybe a whole bunch of padding on the bottom. Right, and that's pretty much our app. So that's it for this week's challenge. I hope you had fun. And don't forget to share your app or your code with the hashtag weeklycodechallenge on Twitter. All the links to the things that I referenced, the binary to decimal converter, the React Bootstrap, everything will have links in the description down below. And also my code, the code that was written today, if you'd like to take a look at that. And again, I hope you had fun, and I'll see you next week.